I also see if I can do like a live thing. Maybe I'll do live on YouTube, see if that works. Let's see here. Oh, maybe the YouTube thing isn't going to work that well. I'm going to try doing Facebook again because that worked in the past. All right. Here we go. And admit a few more people are coming in, so we'll let them trickle in right now. But yeah, thank you all for coming. I'm so excited about this talk. And if you are trying to get CE credit is only given if you are watching. And a few more people are coming in. Here's where let them trickle in right talk. Close that down. It always does that. It pops up the live and then I have like this double thing happening. So I have to shut that down. Anyway, like I was saying, if you are trying to get CE credit for this, you can only get it during the live presentation when you can't get it after the fact by watching the recorded lecture just yet. And in order to ensure that you get credit and a certificate, you have to fill out our course survey. And I'm going to post a link for that in the chat. And if you don't get the link or don't see it, you can also email me at info@ourhonor.org and I can send it to you there. And if you're okay with this, Amy, people can post questions in the chat. Would you like to answer questions as you go along or answer at the end?
I think it may make sense to answer at the end. I'm not going to go through the handout like really, detailed, but I'm going to go through it and then open it up.
Okay. And since a few more people have trickled in, I'll also share the handout again in the chat. So we do also want to keep these CE courses free and accessible to everybody. If you are able to donate, please do, and we accept Venmo at just our honor, or you can go to ourhonor.org/donate. And without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Amy Sukol, is president of Sukol Venture Consulting, a consulting firm for nonprofit organizations, government, and business. Amy has a law degree from Lewis and Clark School, a master's in political science with a focus in public policy, and a master's in education with a focus in secondary social studies. Amy has over 20 years of experience in animal rights as one of the founders of WARN, which is Western Animal Rights Network at Western Washington University, and served as an associate editor for the Animal Law Review at LNC, and focused on animal law and legislative policy in grad school. Amy continues to educate and advocate for best practices in animal welfare in both professional and personal capacities. So thank you very much, and take it away, Amy.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate the introduction. And thank you everybody for attending this talk. I've got a desktop, so I'm going to follow along on my desktop. But I think I'm also going to do a screen share just so that you can follow along with me. And fingers crossed, my Zoom experience is horrible. So just fingers crossed here that it pops up. What did it do to me? Already, it did it. Okay. So what we're going to do is not do screen share because I don't want to mess with it right now. So hopefully if you guys don't have it, make sure you get it afterwards. But as I go through, what we're going to do is we're going to just talk about some key questions. Among them, what is animal rights? What is animal welfare? What is the veterinarian's responsibility to animals? What contradictions exist in the delivery of veterinary care? How might a veterinarian's personal worldview impact their obligation to animals? And how does the veterinarian's geographic culture influence a veterinarian's perspective and those around them? So in other words, what is the status quo in the veterinarian's community? So, people come from all over, and have different perspectives, and their veterinary practices are very different. So I'm just going to kind of speak broadly to all of the different types of veterinary medicine and still kind of cover the core of animal rights. The issues, some of the issues that are going to be are pretty compelling in this area are personal values, political landscape, culture, and economics. So I put in the handout, and if you have it, the veterinary code of conduct. And I highlighted some aspects of some key parts of the code that I think really stood out to me and seemed relevant to the conversation. Among them being, number one, a veterinarian should be influenced only by the welfare of the patient, the needs of the client, the safety of the public, and the need to uphold the public trust. Okay, so the idea that you have the influence should only come, right, from your obligation to the animal, your obligation to the animal's guardian, to the public at large, essentially. The other one is compassion, and number two is clinical care under the terms of a veterinarian client-patient relationship with compassion and respect for animal welfare and human health. So report veterinarians who are deficient in character or competence to the appropriate entities, responsibility to seek changes to laws and regulations which are contrary to the best interests of the patient and public health. A veterinarian shall respect the rights of clients, colleagues, and other professionals, continue to study, apply, and advance, free to choose whom to serve, and should view, evaluate, and treat all persons in any professional activity or circumstance in which they may be involved solely as individuals. So out of that, right, there is a strong emphasis on respect, compassion, but also the welfare of animals. When they talk about rights, however, they talk about the right of the client and the community and other professionals. They don't talk about the right of the patient, because the patient doesn't have any. As we go further down through this, I want to also point out the next stage is concept. So the concept of personhood, sentience, justice, and impact. So personhood being the right to bodily integrity, autonomy, and standing in the law. That's a really big one. Sentience, the awareness of existence and the ability to experience emotion and pain. Justice, the possession of rights and the freedom to exercise those rights. And impact, who and how parties are impacted by decisions entrenched in culture, perception, and economics. That's a lot. But as we go through this, you're going to see the topics we're going to cover. For example, if we take the concepts and the issues that I outlined, and we go, okay, the first box of this table coming up is agriculture, and some of the issues that pop up with veterinary medicine in agriculture is breeding, antibiotics and hormones, the living conditions, slaughter, funding, and transparency. So I'm just going to kind of talk about that briefly and then continue to go down. But I leave the box where it says role of veterinarians blank, because that's really something that you guys answer for yourselves after you really kind of take into full consideration all the things that, or not all, it's not exhaustive, but a lot of the things that are involved in that type of veterinary medicine. And then ask yourself, where's the justice? Where's the, like, if you're talking about sentience, okay, so chicken and cows, pigs, all of that, they're sentient. But they don't have rights. And then the question is, who's impacted by agriculture? And where's the justice, right? one of the things that I think veterinarians, when we talk about the code of conduct, and it says like it's one of your responsibilities to report somebody, another veterinarian that is, violating the codes of conduct. If you think about agriculture, there's going to, in at least from the perspective of animal rights, but also of animal welfare, there's a lot of factory farming. And for those animals that are on those farms, there's a veterinarian, right? And so when we talk about, oh, factory farming is so horrible to animals, then you also have to kind of go to the next level of, okay, well, if it's notoriously bad conditions for animals on these farms, then where is the veterinarian in all that? Are they just overlooking the fact that these animals have maybe open wounds that are emaciated, in distress? That is not that entirely uncommon in, where there's slaughterhouses and the farms. So that's kind of like, and the transparency, right? It's very difficult to get the full scoop on what's going on in some of the, especially the really large factory farms. And then just looking at the living conditions of some of the animals, it doesn't take, an expose or, somebody breaking in to just look at the animals that are crowded and living in their own fecal matter. So when veterinarians, it's like, okay, so you're supposed to have an obligation to the welfare of animals. That say you're in X community and there are X, veterinarians and folks know each other. Where is the conversation in that community of veterinarians that certain veterinarians are practicing in a industry and that is notoriously cruel? And like beyond, like, we're not talking about, okay, eating meat or anything like that, but just the conditions of the animals and how veterinarians feel about that, how they feel about other veterinarians providing service to an industry that does this. As we go down, research also has similar components, although research is it tends to have more, I'd say, regulation around it in just the sense of it's medical, biomedical, and these are drugs that'll eventually get into humans. And so the scope of oversight is a little different, but at the same time, if again, you have your obligation is to the welfare of animals. One case, which is super disturbing, at OHSU, somebody was cleaning something and they accidentally shut this door, and two monkeys, I think, were boiled alive. And so it's like, okay, already from the perspective of animal rights, using animals in experiments that are painful, stressful, whatever, and then having veterinarians in the industry figuring out how to reconcile their obligation to animals and their well-being with using animals as literally, like they say, guinea pigs, as objects to study that have no rights. Going down, entertainment being another one. That's a big one because of circuses and zoos. Property rights is huge when you're talking about, like, for example, a lawsuit was filed against police. There were dogs running around. The police shot the dogs. The owners sued and said that they deprived them of their Fourth Amendment property, and they lost because under the circumstances, the court said, hey, we agree that you had a property right to these dogs, but under the circumstances, they didn't believe that the police acted out of order. So the weight that's given to, again, that's a public safety matter, and it does trump, property rights. But then again, what's lost in the conversation is how easily we can kill an animal and move on. Breeding, clothing, that's, again, living conditions, management and oversight, necessity, transparency. So when you have farms that are breeding animals for fur, they must have veterinarians, right? Those veterinarians are going in and doing something to look at these animals. So where does the veterinarian stand in supporting animal welfare if they're okay with animals being used for something like clothing? That veterinarians need to reconcile that. And sometimes they just go, well, this is a legal industry. Why not? That's a little interesting. Makes you kind of wonder, okay, why are we getting into this field? There are a lot of people who get into different industries that, it's not like necessarily somebody becomes an accountant and just is passionate about numbers. People join professions because it suits them. But when we're talking about animals and animal welfare, the veterinary industry tends to be a little bit more, inclined to be sensitive to animals. So if somebody's joining a profession where the emphasis is to be sensitive to animals, and then you're going in and checking on animals on a fur farm, how do you reconcile the obligation to animals? Religious practices, again, that is more, that is very personal, and the courts are pretty clear about that. It's more about people, we have to have a differentiation between genuine people who are part of an actual religion and somebody who is making a claim but is really not part of any religion. So the question is like, well, where does it begin and where does it end? Who, what views are accepted as you can slaughter an animal for a religious practice because it's your religion, but you wouldn't be able to do that if you just felt like it. So there's some kind of questions about where are the parameters. Culture is huge. Culture is huge. Depending on where you are in the country, attitude towards animals is very different. And so that's one of the reasons why I tend to be sensitive to the idea of veterinarians coming from different worldviews and perspectives, because, the standard is not really the same. I mean, you have the American medical, the veterinary principles, but then how they're applied depending on the area, it can be kind of dicey. So and then there's the business and economics, power distribution, investments made in specific industries, alternatives to animal-based economies, and subsidies to animal-based industries. So we can't be entirely, ignorant to the idea that the laws that allow certain types of farming or allow certain types of industries to exist, those are legislators. And who funds them and where's the transparency? People will argue that the dairy and meat industries have undue influence, not only with legislators, but also with the USDA. And so that brings me to the next section, which is court cases. And I organized this specifically so that the court cases are going to go from most recent to oldest, and then when we get to the statutes, they go from oldest to newest. And there's a reason why I do that. But most recently, if for those of you who are unaware, there was the National Pork Producers Council versus Ross in California. That is considered a huge deal because it allows California to say, look, if your meat was, the animals raised for your meat were raised in ways that we have our standards, then you can't sell it here. That very much bothered legislators in other areas of the country because the businesses that they are often funded from will figure out, okay, well, that is discrimination against my business. and that is discrimination, you know, because you can't have discrimination in interstate commerce. So the question becomes, okay, well, how is that going to, how does that roll out? And it's going to be very interesting. I am interested to see how that works. But at the end of the day, it does put into question not only what are standards for the way animals are raised for meat, but also how commerce works in this country. And we've seen it a little bit in other areas as well. The next case was Wayne Sung, who is a lawyer, and he has been arrested a couple times. And some people call it breaking and entering or trespassing, and others call it rescuing. So he was acquitted, I think, in the first case, and then in the second one, he was found guilty. He's, you know, not going to be spending a considerable amount of time in jail or anything. It was a felony. But the question is right to rescue. That's the legal concept in his case. Do members of the public or anybody have a right to go onto a private property and rescue an animal they believe is in distress? You will find that in some states, if you are walking, you know, down the street and somebody has a dog in the car and it's like 100 degrees outside, the windows are rolled up, you can break into the car and rescue that dog without facing any kind of criminal liability. That again depends on jurisdictions, but there is right to rescue already in existence. And so it just kind of, the question is who gets to rescue, and who which property rights are being held as most important, right? So if you have a right to your car, you have a right to your dog, somebody breaks your window and takes the dog, and that would be legal, then how is that different then from going onto property and seeing some very ill animals and rescuing them? So the context and circumstances change, but the fundamental concepts do pass along. Then we have Justice v. Vircher. And that is also, there is a theme, and it will, you're going to see it going through the cases where you find that animals who've been abused will not achieve any kind of, or have any redress for that abuse, because they can't speak for themselves. And it's sort of a catch-22. How do you afford somebody the ability to get justice for their own abuse if they can't speak for themselves and they don't have any standing in court? So like with Justice, the Animal Legal Defense Fund, they have put forth this case, and it will be, I mean, they're really going for it. They want to see that animals are recognized for the purpose of standing. And that in public, people assume that, and you know, a lot of people think animal rights means, oh, you want, you know, dogs to drive a car, or, you know, just extreme and absurd scenarios. The concept of animal rights has a lot to do, if not does have to do, with the idea that you can be represented in court, and that you can receive justice for your abuse. And as we go down, the Anti-Vivisection Society, they went after USDA for failing to apply standards to birds. The USDA was sort of dragging their feet, and the court found that the USDA had been capricious and arbitrary, but they weren't so sure about whether how much they dragged their feet. So they remanded it back. The point being is, why is the USDA arbitrary and capricious about enforcing the law? And the point that is really important here is that if we rely only on government, to the regulators, to uphold the law, make sure that you're inspecting the facilities and the facilities look good, yay. But it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen, right? There's ample evidence to show that the USDA and other government entities just don't, either they don't have the funding and they just don't, they're not proactive, and it's a pattern. And so if you can't get regulators to enforce the law and do their job, then you need civil suits. You need some, members of the public to say, okay, well, if they're not going to do it, then we're going to do it. Unfortunately, though, members of the public are not going to be allowed to do that because they're not the one with the injury. So they don't have standing, and animals don't have standing. And that'll bring us down to, I'm going to skip the ALDF case, although I would say with that one, so Animal Legal Defense Fund sued Roadside Zoo because of the condition of a tiger that was just in terrible condition. They wanted to see, documents, and essentially, though, they were told tough that you don't have standing, and unfortunately, the tiger died. And then after that, the court and attorneys arguing that the issue's moot. So unfortunately, because the animal died, the issue became moot, or at least it was argued that way. And that's loss of life, right? So in the course of trying to figure these things out, there are animals whose lives and living conditions are at stake. So it takes a long time. And in the meantime, those animals are suffering. The biggest one, I think, was the ASPCA versus the Ringling Brothers. That lawsuit went on for a long time. And there is a strategy there. So if the court felt that the ASPCA was being relentless, yeah, that's exactly what they were trying to do. They are pushing it. They're just pushing to see how far they can get the courts to recognize that these animals are being abused and somebody needs to do something about it. And each and every time they brought this case before the court said, sorry, there's no standing. And even towards the end, as you get to 2017, so it started in about 2001, 2003, and it kept the multiple lawsuits till 2017. And at that point, the court said, we don't bring this back to us. So then Ringling Brothers sued the ASPCA, and they got a $9 million settlement from the ASPCA for harassment. Which again, it's just like, what is that, right? You don't give animals the right to voice, they don't have a voice, they don't have standing. You're saying that human beings who want to assert some, say, hey, this is abuse, they don't have standing. So ultimately, these animals are just, there's no recourse. And again, the USDA culture, they're not going to be on site all the time to catch abuse. And obviously that kind of abuse isn't something that Ringling Brothers is going to show the government when it's on site, right? So it leaves the power to hold people accountable strictly to the government. And then there's just so many loopholes and ways that abusers can get around that, whether it is hiding the abuse when there is a regulator there, to underfunding of the agency, to just the complacency of the people themselves. All of these cases, as you go further back, it is the same thing. So I won't go through all of them, but I am going to say that even when you go from the American Horse Protection Association suit, Taub versus State of Maryland, and then the first one being Sierra Club versus Morton, which was about trees, could an organization sue anybody, but in this particular case, it was the government, on behalf of a, organic entity or whatever. So again, that was the first time, I think, where they said, no, sorry, you don't have standing. You can't represent them because you don't have any injury, and they can't represent themselves. So it just moves forward. Like, so the deforestation and the development move forward, because there was nobody had the legal right to defend the land. Now, when we go to legislation, we're going all the way back, right? So when we talk about court cases, we're talking about early on environmental effort, told there's no standing. That was huge, by the way, the Sierra case. And that kicked off series of court cases trying to identify some level of right for animals so that they had standing. Legislation 1900, you got Lacey Act, and some very basic, I mean, and before I get into that, I am going to point out at the very end of the handout, one of the things that I really recommend you guys read is this article called The History of Animal Protection in the United States, and I hyperlinked it. So if you have an electronic copy, you can open it, but that really goes back to like early like 1600s, where, you know, colonists are just identifying, okay, well, that guy, you know, beat his dog or something like that. So they create very like parochial rules around the treatment of animals. And it, you know, you're talking about like some probably really egregious cases. And then as you get further in down the line, you see that we have the Humane Slaughter Act. You see the Federal Animal Welfare Act. You get to the 70s, the Endangered Species Act is 73. But if you look at the timeline, so you see like a bunch, I didn't even come close to sharing all of the court cases that have gone through trying to assert animal rights and provide some level of like better standard for how animals are treated. And then you get to the legislation, and it's pretty sparse on a federal level. A lot of the animal protection laws are going to be on state levels. But on a federal level, right, that's where you can kind of say, okay, like no dog fighting, no cockfighting, period. Nobody can do it. It sort of sets a national standard for how animals are treated. And you get to 2010, where the Crush Video Prohibition Act was signed. And what they did was they said crush videos are illegal. Like you can't make them and you can't sell them. They didn't actually add the part about animal abuse in the video is being illegal. They forgot about that part. So you get to the Shark Conservation Act of 2010, and then in 2019, the PACT Act, which was a extension or an amendment of the Crush Video Act, which said not only can you not make the videos, you can't sell the videos, but the animal abuse in the video is also a crime, and that a federal crime. So in looking at cases and the statutes, the question becomes, what is our standard? How do veterinarians see themselves in these spaces? Because with animal rights, again, it's a very misunderstood concept, I think, among the public, being that it means that animals are exactly just like people, and they lead to these really absurd, extreme, scenarios. When really fundamentally, all it means is animals don't have to be abused, and that they will have their that they get a day in court, that somebody else can represent them. And it's not going to be wholly the federal government or the state government's responsibility to hold others accountable, because it's too much, by the way. And it may not even be that there's complacency or lack of funding or whatever. People hide things. So having a route for advocates to provide representation holds people accountable. right? As far as, you know, the idea of veterinarians getting sued, like, oh, okay, you know, mistake was made, or maybe not, but having to face lawsuits because now animals have standing in court. That's kind of an extreme. That is an extreme, because what animal rights is trying to say is you don't have the human doesn't have the right to abuse an animal. So when you're talking about malpractice, that kind of thing, that's literally, that can be in the letter of the law. I mean, you can write a legislation to include certain things and exclude certain things. So the people do jump to the most extreme scenario, but it doesn't have to be that way. And the more involved veterinarians are in in advocating animal rights, the more that they can see the process and have a voice and like saying, okay, well, here, this is something that like we support animal rights and we think this legislation's good, but how can we carve out some flexibility for veterinarians who, you know, sometimes their mistakes are made. We just don't want to be pulled into something that wasn't intended for us. And that is, again, it doesn't have to be ideological. It can literally just be about parsing out legislation. And it's done all the time. So again, the concept of animal welfare and animal rights, the obligation to them in the industry of veterinary medicine, but then saying, okay, we have this huge obligation and commitment to animal welfare, but we don't want to get sued. You know, it's sort of like, where's the give and take? Are you willing to abandon animals to unregulated suffering out of fear of being sued? It doesn't have to be like that. It doesn't have to be so extreme. When I go through, and now I'm going to open it up for questions, because I think that I kind of laid out the groundwork for what we're talking about here. And I think that I'd be interested to hear, as veterinarians and as practitioners, what are the decisions that you feel compromise your ability to communicate with your clients? I do want to also point out, though, that this presentation to help you communicate with your clients is also feeling empowered to say you support animal rights, and not be feeling like you're going to be pigeonholed as some sort of extremist, that you have the language that you can use to impart the concepts and the purposes comfortably, and not against your own industry. And I'm sorry, my cat's toy is making noise. So with that, I do want to open it up for any questions.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start it off. I know a lot of veterinarians, myself included, we come from an agricultural background. We got into veterinary medicine. You know, I started off in 4-H, and I was very much normalized to violence against animals growing up. And then in veterinary school, there were classes even that you could take that required you to kill animals to practice surgery on them. And this is still widespread in veterinary school. Many schools still require students to kill animals. And the students who speak up about it and want to be conscientious objectors are bullied, retaliated against, even suffer failing grades sometimes, which I understand is a violation of like our First Amendment rights. And it violates the very concept of the 3 R's, which is reduce animals, replace and refine our practices and our teaching protocols. So could you talk about, maybe just briefly, like what rights do students have who are conscientious objectors to animal harm in vet school?
Well, I would say it would be very, for veterinary medicine, I would say it'd be very specific to the protocol there. But I would say that a vet student who is against killing an animal would say, there's an alternative out there, and I should have the right to select that alternative. I mean, the rights that you have, it's sort of kind of like First Amendment, all that stuff really kind of applies to government, right? And what the government is allowed to do. And so you do get kind of stuck in an industry with its own standards. And as long as those standards aren't illegal, then they're going to be held to the curricula that the industry has. That said, I would say that it would benefit both students and animals for students to feel more empowered to speak up and to identify alternatives to whatever practice is going on, like you said, killing or any other practice that could be substituted for something that is humane or doesn't involve killing or doing, any kind of experimenting on animals at all. So if the veterinary field starts to, and again, it starts with 1, 2, 3, collectively, you identify, okay, this would be better. And then pitching that is to the veterinary schools and teachers, and making sure that you're progressing to something more humane. And that's what I would say is find the language that says, I know what I'm talking about. I'm not, this isn't some extreme, extremist position. And here are some alternatives to doing this. And I would like the school to really consider that.
Yeah. And I feel like students have to, like, it's so frustrating. I know many veterinarians have gone through this, and it feels like every year we have to keep reinventing the wheel. And I feel like, new groups of students rise up and we don't talk to each other, and we don't like say, hey, this is what I did for my school. And there's no like big movement. Hopefully our honor can be like that one big movement students can go to and not feel like, oh my God, now I have to like develop this whole curriculum while I'm in vet school and while I'm burdened with all of this other stuff and the social pressure to conform. And I'm worried that I'll be viewed as this troublemaker who is not going to get any advancement. I'm not going to get scholarships. Professors won't want to take me under their wing because I'm viewed as this like challenging person to deal with. So I know it's hard, but our honor is here to help. And like, I think things are changing.
Yeah.
Another like, and what about public schools? Like a lot of these veterinary schools are in public schools. Is that like, should they have more rights because these are public schools?
I don't think it would make a difference, because the standards are going to be the field of veterinary medicine. So as long as there's no like if it's religious exemption, so if the student themselves fits into a category that can make the argument that this particular test or this particular activity, it violates my rights because, again, my religion or something like that, then they could make that case in either circumstance. But I'd say that without any kind of special right, the human not having any special right, it's going to be the same. I would, however, argue that to what you were saying earlier, that students in the veterinary practice feeling alone, I would definitely encourage them to buddy up with law students in animal law fields, because animal law would love that. They would love to have a conversation with the folks that are going to be next generation veterinarians and help them identify routes and strategies to improve their field. And so like when I was in law school, I started out in one law school and I transferred, and the first law school was very hostile to the idea of animal rights. And I did get bullied and teased for my position on it. And I transferred to a different law school because the one I want, Lewis and Clark, is in Portland. And ultimately I wanted to live in Portland, but they have an animal law program. So it was a lot in better company. But I didn't back down. And you know what? The professors at that time, they were not at all fazed by it. They were actually kind of supportive of it. And I think that when you encounter teachers who are interested in advancement and innovation, stuff like that, then they're kind of like, that's cool. We think you belong in this field because you're passionate about this. Teachers who are going to kind of muzzle you are going to be the ones that, that's unfortunate. And, but I would say partnering with other fields that are heavily involved in animal rights would benefit veterinarians and veterinarian students.
Yeah, our owner definitely wants to do that. We want to get law students and vet students talking to each other some more about these issues and hopefully collaborating on some of these things. And another thing is the American Veterinary Medical Association. This is a trade organization. You don't have to be a member to be a veterinarian. 100,000 of us are members because this is how we advance policy in animals, and all the legislators tend to listen to the AVMA with everything to do with animals because we're supposed to be the experts. But the AVMA has, bullied and retaliated against veterinarians advocating for better policies with regard to depopulation. Many of us have written extensively about ventilation shutdown, where they seal up barns, pump in heat, and wait for the animals inside to die in response to avian influenza. Our story just made the front page of the New York Times today, so check that out. And we uncovered the bailouts that these companies got. But meanwhile, all of this writing that we've done, I, as an AVMA member, and several other of us, some of us on this call, were banned from attending the AVMA's Humane Ending Symposium, which discussed this. And the symposium was supposed to be a member benefit for us to go to. I was also barred from attending the AVMA's legislative fly-in. And the AVMA leadership even took to the media and said that they had to keep us out to create a safe space for producers to discuss depopulation events. And the National Pork Producers Council Vice President of Communications, Jeff Pigote, was able to attend, was welcomed. He's not even a veterinarian. Meanwhile, we were barred from attending. Do we have any grounds for this? I mean, the defamation that they said, implying that we were somehow violent or unprofessional, and just being prevented from even having a seat at the table when we're a bunch of quiet lady veterinarians just trying.
Yeah, that's well, and there is a really kind of strikes me as shady exclusion, and for a very specific industry. It's sort of like, again, going back to the principles, they talk about the obligation to animals and their guardians and the public safety. So I'm not really sure how breeding pigs and pigs and cows and chickens that are in these, in squalor, and then killing them, and then having disease, then you have to cull these animals, like how that fits in with having an obligation to animals and public health. It really doesn't. So what I would recommend, again, is going back to partnering with legal organizations that have a passion for animals. And Animal Legal Defense Fund is phenomenal. I mean, they really, I was on the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund, and they take on some cases, and they provide, I think, a good amount of legitimacy to the conversation, because again, you get some other voices in there that seem very extreme. And so it's hard to move forward when people have in their head that, these are just a bunch of like, extremists. So ALDF puts into context what we're really talking about, and like what's at stake. And it's not like, oh my gosh, now all these people are going to be out of a job. Like, you're not going to have, veterinary medicine is going to be all sued out of, practice. And these are these are kind of tactics to scare people, I think, and to get people to feel like, oh, oof, I feel for it, but I mean, oh, I don't want to be stuck in the same, stuck having to defend my practice when an animal wasn't being abused. So, Animal Legal Defense Fund is phenomenal. And I would also be checking out any other, they're known nationally, but they just happen to be located out here. But I would say any legal organization. And actually Lewis and Clark has a phenomenal animal law program, and the professors and some of the people who who attended and were involved in animal law practice out in the field too. So finding those people and just figuring out, okay, how do we collaborate and find a way to bring more awareness? Also publications that are that are, popular. I know Guardian tends to cover these issues quite a bit, but sometimes you just need that ear, that famous ear or that influential ear, and then the teeth of the law to follow up. And I want to say, if I could think of another one, and also it could be kind of specific, right? Like if it's birds, you're going to have an organization that's an advocate for birds. So thinking about like farm animals, who is going to be most likely to advocate for those animals, and then partnering up. And it should go across the board, to any field that emphasizes animals, animal rights, and moving forward with the launch and changing some of these practices. And they cross all different, I think, fields. Education is one, and especially when you're talking about like even high school, and dissecting, animals in science class. That there are institutions across the board that are potential allies.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. We've been working for years on this, and it's like 2 years after the avian influenza outbreak, we finally got the New York Times to write about this. And so it takes diligence and determination and constant, just the amount of effort that has gone into this by multiple organizations. And we're still like barely scratching the surface of it.
Yeah.
It's a challenge. So we need all of your help for sure. And yeah, I mean, I think you talk about like all these animals on farms living in squalor and stuff. And there's this pervasive belief, like it's almost a thought-stopping cliche in the veterinary profession. And I compare the veterinary profession and education to a cult in many ways. It checks a lot of the boxes with our special terminology, the hierarchies, the thought-stopping cliches, all of the things. But we're taught that, well, animals in the wild suffer. We have to feed 10 billion people. There's this belief that most people still believe we have to eat animals, and we are not going to ever move away from eating animals. We need to eat animals to be healthy. How do we feed all of these 10 billion people? Well, chickens are the best way, especially with climate change. Like they are the most supposedly most climate friendly animal slaughter-based protein source. So what are we supposed to do? And so I think they don't see this as criminal animal cruelty. They see themselves as feeding the world and being part of the solution. And people like us, animal activists, are a problem. We are defaming them. We're causing problems. We're threatening our food security. And so it'll take a lot of messaging to them to get through. And I really hope in general, more people start to message to the veterinary profession in a very friendly way, because I think the hatred that animal rights activists have thrown at veterinarians, even threatening to kill them. Like I know researchers who are working to make less cruel depopulation methods, who I love their work because they're trying to make things better. Sorry, have suffered death threats.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's kind of the issue now. If so, you want to answer some of the questions in the chat while I
Oh,
think.
sure. Yeah. And you know, I would also, and to your point about messaging that the animal rights movement, a lot of the, and it should be the focus of animals and, you know, improving their conditions. But in terms of just messaging and trying to, you know, have that conversation with people who are on the fence or maybe on the other side, is what are the alternatives? You know what I mean? Like, this isn't about like, oh, well, you know, we'll never get medicine. Where's our medicine going to come from? I mean, food and medicine, these things can be accomplished without the use of animals. And when we talk about meat, there are a lot of people out there who only were huge meat eaters and they tried an Impossible Burger or something like that, and they go, oh, this is actually not bad. And I'm like, yeah, well, and so if you get some people who are like, they have to have the best of, you know, or whatever they think is the best of the best, it has to be real steak or it's not, you know. And then there are people who are like, you know what, it's enough for me to pivot to a plant-based because of the suffering of animals. And so those alternatives, talking about alternatives, reminding people of alternatives is another way of getting through to people who are just unsure and just don't see any other way of doing something. I'm looking at really the ethical question. I'm sorry, I'm looking at quotes. I realize it's so. And UK ruling. So along the lines of culture and religion, the UK had a ruling that ethical veganism was a protected characteristic under law. I realize it's quite different to what this webinar is about. But wondering if it could open the door. Absolutely. I think it absolutely, it touches on what we're talking about. And it does open the door. Absolutely. You know, I think that's awesome. And I think that everything's a start. And it's very frustrating watching, like, you know, out of the US, they're doing a lot more than we are. And that has a lot to do with our funding and our laws and, you know, just the transparency. And agriculture has a tremendous amount of money that they can funnel into the system. So that is wonderful, and we need to be working on that. I know that there are legislators out there who are passionate, and just getting to them nonstop and getting them to, like, for example, not take pictures, PR pictures at a dairy farm. I mean, we have that, and that needs to change as well. And I don't know if I'm over time or if I'm at time.
Yeah, no, we're doing good. Yeah, and Heidi points out soya for chicken feed and how that's a major cause of deforestation.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, if you want to get your CE certificate, go to ourhonor.org/SUCL survey. That's where you can get your fill out the survey, and then you can get your certificate that way. But yeah, any other questions?
And I wasn't sure, when do we end, so I can,
Like 1 o'clock, like now-ish.
we have a little bit of, well, if I said there's a country in Central South America that gave rights to nature, specifically rivers. Again, that kind of goes back to the Sierra v. Morton case, about whether or not natural, you know, the earth has a right. And it's crazy. Like, we can't even get animals who suffer any representation in court. So, and who's to say, I wouldn't be surprised if there are people out there who would be more inclined to give a tree a right over a pig, because they eat pigs and they like the taste of pork, and that's just the lifestyle they want to lead. And so it's sort of like when you can visualize the unnecessary suffering, when you can visualize the alternatives to it, then I think little by little, you're going to start to go, I don't really need this. I don't really need a burger. I don't really need, a leather belt or whatever. I think that people just, it may be just a little bit at a time, but yes, that is an interesting case. And it is something that environmentalists, tackle, is the right to represent, trees and natural resources. And I think if there's any other questions, I'll say, just to emphasize, the last page of the handout had some reading recommendations. And as I mentioned, the History of Animal Protection is a phenomenal article, and it really does cover how animal rights evolved, and like who, took the helm of that, and how it was perceived, and that we can represent animals in a manner that is respectful of other people's worldviews and where they're coming from, while also saying that this is not the end all. We don't have to rely on animals, and that if we're truly a smart species, we can innovate and evolve away from animal subsistence. And just legislators are huge. And I would say that the courts, as long as they keep saying that animals cannot have standing, then you really need those statutes and those laws passed.
Yeah, very good. I'm adding in our GIF link to our New York Times article that was published on the front page today, which kind of shows that even if you do not eat these products, you are still paying for them, whether you eat them or not. So we really have to change the incentivization of these things, and maybe redistribute some of the public funds to support slaughter-free food production.
Absolutely. And that was something that it really frustrated me when I saw a legislator and governor like taking photos at dairy farms, and it's like we pay 3 times more for climate friendly alternatives because these huge big ag production fund contribute campaign funds to people. So that's a problem, and that goes beyond animals. It's to a lot of the issues that we have in this country. And so calling out those people, calling out those legislators and public figures for doing that is important, and saying, hey, yeah, I don't know why you're taking a picture of yourself at a dairy farm. Like, this is weird. Like, it's a very specific industry.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about all of the industries that the slaughter-based protein industry affects, it's also very closely tied to the pharmaceutical industry. If we decrease the number of animals we slaughter every year, that would affect pharmaceutical profits and the feed industry as well, the animal industry. So there's multiple interconnected industries here that we have to disentangle and divest from in order to encourage more alternatives or slaughter-free methods of production. And but it's challenging when so many of these corporations are reliant on slaughtering animals for their own profits.
The economy, the issue of the economy, and the supply chain, that ecosystem of like, okay, well, the farm, buys the feed, and the feed is, this business, and then the medical industry, and all of that is wrapped up. And that's true for a lot of the things that tobacco. I mean, nobody said, well, what are we going to do with all the paper that roll, of course, there's things that were the timber industry. They said jobs. And it's like, there are valid concerns about how your economy is impacted, but you can't use the economy as an excuse to destroy the planet and cause harm. Like, we have to think bigger and smarter about these things. And that just because we don't, like, for example, clear cut doesn't mean that people are going to be just completely out of work. We need to, there are jobs, we work with that. But if our if our response to any kind of positive change is, well, what about the jobs? You're not going to have a planet anymore to have those jobs. And animals and the animal-based industry is very damaging to the planet. And so it also goes along with climate change and ecology, all of it. So it's really people, there are certain buzzwords that are used: economy, jobs, and that scares people. And so immediately they go, oh, rights, that means that they're going to like have more rights than my kid, So these are that's extreme messaging that's trying to scare people away from positive change. And the positive change doesn't have to happen overnight. It can happen little by little. I didn't get meat out of my diet overnight. I didn't get most dairy out of my diet overnight. It can take a while, but that's part of evolving. We evolve.
Mhm.
And in veterinarians, their voice is huge. It's super important. And it, like many other industries where they're very status quo and aren't moving along with the times, that the newer generation, it will struggle with the older, the older administrations and how they view the world and what they think. I mean, you see it in education a lot. So we just, the idea of having collaboration among the different fields and making sure that you guys are all just like really tapped in and really bugging those legislators,
Yeah.
bugging them and finding out like, hey, where is this money going? And like, not everybody, our taxes, not everybody supports this, and yet we're paying taxes, and who gets to be subsidized and who doesn't get to be subsidized. Like, why isn't you go to, I took pictures at the store once because they had this sort of mediocre section of plant-based, like, cheese and milk and stuff like that. And it was picked clean. And then over there was just like rows and rows and rows of like untouched jugs of milk, just tons of it. And I'm like, wow, all of that's going to go in the garbage. And that's what our taxes paid for. Meanwhile, there's a strong demand right here, and it's 3 times more expensive. And Lord knows it's not getting subsidized. So we also want the companies that make plant-based alternatives. Where are they? They've got to have lobbying.
Yeah.
Meetings.
I mean, I kind of envision the future of like, why isn't Cargill and Tyson and these other industries, don't they want to support their transition to slaughter free because they're having trouble hiring enough workers? Climate change is a threat to them too. They're not going to be able to grow enough feed to feed their animals. That is declining. So don't they want, instead of all these subsidies going to build more slaughterhouses, which, millions and millions of dollars in grant money is going to produce more slaughterhouses, which is needed in the short term, but long term, like we don't have enough people to staff them. Shouldn't they get involved in lobbying for a transition to slaughter free as well?
I think that to an extent, I have seen some companies that are animal based switching, or not switching, but like including plant-based options. But I think the problem is the animal stuff is what's subsidized.
Yeah. Well,
So if the legislators are only willing to pay for the slaughter and the animals, but not the plant-based stuff, and even just kind of cultivating and providing that plant-based alternative, different processes, different type of economy, maybe. That the government needs to get more involved in that, understand it, support it. And we need to have a change in how we subsidize food in this country, because we, like, even just having a salad, there's a tremendous amount of research done on the fact that the US government advocates meat and it needs to stop. And that the only way we can get out of that is making things, other options, affordable and accessible.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's you talk about like the wasted animal products. It's like, even my vet school, we had probably a quarter of our class were vegetarians, and we'd have like the talks and we'd have like the vegetarian food and the rest of the food. I mean, back then vegans, you know, we didn't have very many vegans, but at least we had vegetarians. And the vegetarian, sometimes there were some vegan options, pile would be gone and there'd be all of this meat stuff left over. And same, I used to work for an animal shelter that served slaughter-based food to volunteers and stuff at their events, which they were the only animal shelter in the San Francisco Bay Area that did this. All the other animal shelters had, you know, recognized that, hey, we're here to help animals and not, and so they would only have vegan food for their people at their events and stuff. But this one shelter didn't. And it's the same thing. All of this slaughter-based food is all going to waste, and all of the vegan, vegetarian food would be gone first. It's like,
it is taken for granted that meat is normal, that it's totally normal. Like people who I have plant-based ice cream. It's delicious. It is absolutely delicious. So offering it to somebody that, ooh, and I go, it's nuts. These are nuts. This is what desserts are made of, you know, should be made of, is nuts and berries, things like that, vanilla, cocoa. Like, but you prefer the liquid that comes out of a cow that's not even intended for you. So what is actually gross here? Like the idea of plants and nuts and stuff. So it is definitely psychological. It's very psychological, and the government does. It just pushes it. It's like reinforces old ways. Like our you know, food pyramid, you know, now it's like people have a lot of meat and just a little veggies and hardly any carbs. Well, back in the day, it used to be a little bit of meat, mostly fruits and vegetables and grains. So the power of an industry really took form. It's sort of like any kind of super powerful but not very healthy industry that we have in the country, that they get so big that they have so much money that they can get their businesses subsidized and they can grow, and then anybody else is you know not part of the gang and you end up paying a whole lot more for it. So it gets to the point where you're like, okay, really got to hold legislators accountable for where they're getting their money, and call them out for it. And then to the ones that are potentially open, having those conversations with them and saying, okay, we know that, you know, the state or subsidizes meat. This is how much we want to divert a percentage of that to plant-based, to the point where we get to where the plant-based is maybe mostly subsidized and the meat part isn't. And that is going to take a long time. That will take a long time, but it's possible.
It might not take a long time if we believe it. We'll see.
If you, diligent. Yeah, with diligence.
Have, stories on the front page of the New York Times today. So things are changing.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. I got to run because I got an appointment to get to.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And if you need anything, follow up from me or any other material, let me know.
Okay, awesome. All right.
All right.
Thank you. I'll talk to you later.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.